The third line theme is the theme of bonds made and broken. And it is a very personal theme of dealing with the trial and error process, the suffering that comes with the potential for failure. And one of the things to recognize is that the leadership that comes out of that is a leadership that's based on its own trial and error process. And then that leadership based on its own trial and error process, that's laid out as a way for followers. But it is very personal. It is not transpersonal in that sense. It comes out of the personal process. This didn't work for me, ergo, it will not work for you. Okay, so this is the way in which that movement works. When we step over that invisible line and we go to the fourth color and its relationship in resonance to the fourth line, we move into the transpersonal. And in moving into the transpersonal, development requires relationship. In other words, there is no development without a direct relationship to the other. Now, that direct relationship to the other in the fourth color, the color of need, this is a polarity of the master and the novice. And this relationship of master and novice, and to take that out of the spiritual context, just somebody who knows something and somebody who doesn't, that they cannot get that impersonally. They're not going to be able to get that by being at the back of the auditorium in a university lecture space. They need to have the direct contact in order for them to develop. And it's a very important thing. Third color people don't need direct contact to develop. They're not dependent on the other in that way. What they need is guidelines that they can work with themselves. And if those guidelines happen to be correct for them, then everything is fine. But the moment that you're dealing with the fourth color and the way in which the fourth color influences the fourth line, its potential for opportunity, its potential to influence others, its potential to externalize, that development is based on a personal relationship, a personal developmental process through the agency of another. And so these two colors represent two very basic ways in which we're guided to develop, both from within ourselves and by the larger society that is around us. The impersonal development that's rooted in the third color, and this very personal development that's rooted in the fourth color. There's something that you can intuit here and see very clearly about the distinction between the third and fourth color. Remember the third and fourth color, like the third and fourth line? These are not stable points because they're places of transition. But look at the difference. When we're dealing with the fourth color is a harmony to the first. We have yet to see the harmony of the third color to the sixth. And I want to take away one of those illusions that people have or simply not getting it right. When you look at master novice, the first thing you think about is spiritual masters. It's one of the first things that comes into mind. The master, because the language is there. The master and the novice. Now look, that fourth color has nothing to do with the second color. That's dissonance. It has nothing to do with the spirituality. It is the externalization of the fear. It is the influencing of others through that. And it is the opportunist who takes the advantage and the opportunity to be able to do that, to be able to externalize that. The master is either a master of communalism or a master of separatism. Whatever it may be, but I want you to understand that it is really mundane. What it's talking about is something very simple. Some people can only learn directly. I know that. I know that in my own experience. There's some people that can only learn human design, from me, direct. There are other people that will learn human design in any way that's impersonal. They'll read the book and they'll take this and take that. In other words, there are different ways in which we develop. But it's very important to see that if you're carrying a fourth line in your profile, for you to understand that valued learning in your life must come directly from a teacher. In other words, you have to have that direct contact, and it's only out of that direct contact that you're really going to be able to develop. At the same time that if you're a third line being in your profile, to recognize that that's not the answer for you. That the answer for you is simply being able to get access to the right kind of information for guidance, rather than being dependent on development through a personal relationship. In other words, having to be shown. It's like people that, buy something and there's a manual. There are some people that can just go through that manual and they figure it all out by themselves and everything's terrific. They've been given their third line guidance. And then there's that third color. And then there's that fourth color person that you give them that manual and they get on the phone and call a friend. Excuse me, come over here and help me. Because otherwise I'm not going to get this. So it's as developmental themes, how important to see that. And also, again, where my concern always is for kids, to really look at your children, for example, and look at young kids going into school and stuff like that. Look at the mental themes they have in terms of line themes, and see very clearly where they're going to need direct help or where they don't need direct help. In other words, to begin to understand, or through their profile, to begin to understand what will help them develop better, more easily. And of course, that fourth color, the third color, they're going to show you through their resonance, in that sense, to the lines, they're going to show you what kind of developmental process is best for that being. So very important theme, to look at and to recognize that, the very basic difference between them. And don't think master novice is spiritual, because it isn't. It isn't. It's simply about learning how to, getting knowledge directly from the other. You got to be in their aura. You got to be able to smell them. You got to be able to touch them. You have to have that connection to them.
Now all the fourth profiles come to touch you. Be careful.
Well, no, I mean, I'm having all those first lines. I have a harmony to that process. In other words, I understand that need, which is why to some level, I can allow people to get into my aura, because it's written in that sense. And of course, what I'm giving them is all this first line structure stuff, so all of that is fine. But it's what's important for me in the distinction between the two is how valuable that is in helping people and guiding people towards what developmentally will work for them. In other words, if you have a strong third color resonating in your design, you don't have to go to the guru to have that trial and error experience. You can read the guru's book. You don't physically have to be there. You don't have to have the contact. You don't have to have the contact to get the buzz. In other words, you can read the book and get just the same experience as the fourth color person who has to be there in the aura. And this is something so important to grasp. It's just different ways that we develop. And once we understand that about ourselves, then we can stop punishing ourselves. Forcing ourselves to do a fourth color job when it's really a third color. In other words, allowing ourselves to develop correctly. And again, when I say things like that, not about choices. If you are living out your design, if you're honoring your strategy, your authority, you're going to operate correctly and according to the way in which you resonate to things and so forth and so on. And if you're a fourth line in your profile, it's going to be very hard for you not to have somebody directly teach you in that sense. In other words, these things are going to come if you're living out, your process correctly. Again, I want to remind you that we're working from the bottom up, so that it is color that, conditions the way in which the line is going to operate. And as such, it creates a limitation. The reality is that the third color is going to be limited in terms of their development by those things that they develop themselves. And what's going to happen to them is, of course, because of conditioning at other levels, that they can be tempted to go into the fourth color process And that fourth color process isn't going to bring them development. In other words, development is going to be limited to them finding, quote unquote, their truth. And finding their truth, and whether it means being the follower at the impersonal level in order to get to a point whether through trial and error that is truth or not, it ultimately is their own process. Development for them is their own personal development, and they're the ones that have to come to their own truth. And by the way, when they come to their own truth, they're the embodiment of that leadership. In other words, that's the moment that they've really developed. They've developed to a point where they have their own structure that they have developed into on their own. But when you're dealing with somebody who's resonating to the fourth color, they're not going to be able to develop without the other. They can't. Look at the way the fourth line works, the opportunist. Don't leave a lover till you have another lover. You can't do it without the other. And so you better wait until there's another to take the place of the other so you can have that direct development. Don't leave your job till you have another job. I mean, it's the same thing. And all of that is being motivated by this underlying theme of the fourth color that says the only development that you're going to get in this life is through learning, through growing, through that process of connecting with the other directly. It's one of the keys in management. Is to be able to see the way in which employees need to be guided. Because the third color employee can get a memo in the mail. But the fourth color employee needs that direct, excuse me, because there has to be that direct contact. So we are being conditioned in that sense underneath that line level to develop in those ways. So why waste your time? Again, the value of mechanical knowledge is at the moment that you can see what you, in that sense, resonate at the profile level. Aside from, as I'm saying, you have one angle here to get access to the feel of color, and that's through what you already have as a profile and seeing the resonance. When you get to a point, if you can, to be able to see your colors, and your colors not just in your profile, but every single one of your gates, you'll begin to see how incredible this underlying motivational package operates. But very, very important at the surface to recognize that if you're going to be either a third line or a fourth line being in terms of your profile, to recognize the conditioning influences on you and to be very clear how important that is for you. That you need to go in that direction, in that sense. It's going to pull you in that direction. The forces are going to pull you in that direction. They're either going to pull you into the personal or they're going to pull you into the impersonal. And you can see how that's affected you in your life. In other words, you can see why, your developmental direction has gone in a certain way. And certainly in the future, this motivational knowledge, remember, this knowledge is basically useless. It is. Until we have enough human beings who have accurate time, to be able to generally apply this knowledge correctly, because just by looking at the resonance you have in your profile, all that's telling you is what the conditioning forces do to you. It doesn't really tell you what is truly natural in that sense for you. So until you get to the point, until we have population that gets to the point where they know their own colors, where we can as professionals analyze that completely, only then are we going to see how complex the underlying motivational field is. And that it's so important for us to let go. Again, I take you to this level of knowledge simply to remind you that you're helpless. There's all these motivational forces underneath you have no control over, and the only way that you're going to operate correctly through all of this is you operate as yourself. You operate according to your design, and then you'll see that those things will work correctly for you. Very easy for me with all my first lines to resonate to my personal contact with the voice. In other words, it's very clear to see why that was going to be my development. Aside from anything else, great conditioning factor on me. In other words, these are things that you can begin to look at, and you can look at your own process, and you can see how these motivational themes in the larger world have conditioned you and influenced you. And of course, the difficulty in all of that is that many people are influenced into, let's say, a fourth color process when in fact it isn't for them. Or a third color process and in fact it isn't for them. But it's hard for us to tell until we can see precisely what their design is. I always wait and see over the years when people recognize that something's funny. Now, I don't mean funny in terms of humor, I mean funny, strange. And nobody's ever mentioned it to me. Look at profile, and you'll notice something very, 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 very unusual about the fourth line. And the one thing to notice about the fourth line is that the fourth line is the only line that is never part of the left angle. It's the only one. You have the 1-4, the 2-4, the 4-6, and the 4-1, but you have no left angle 4. And the reason that I bring this up is to understand that when you're looking at the structure of color and you're looking at it in terms of its three binaries, and we looked at the first binary this morning and looking at the structure of the 1-2 and seeing this as a basic framework, the church and state, the basic structure. We've looked at 3-4 and see that 3-4 is about development. It's all about development. And by the way, that development is always personal, even though it looks like, for example, the fourth color, that it's transpersonal because you have to get it from the other, but it's still the way you get it. In other words, you have to get it directly rather than you have to get it indirectly. So the moment that we move to the final binary, when we move to the fifth and sixth colors, you can really see that the left angle quality is really very, very different than those other four colors beforehand. And very different because what they represent is they represent completion in that sense of the developmental process. And completion of the developmental process in the sense of articulating that outwards, transpersonally, getting the word out or getting the news out. And again, two ways of doing that. Two ways of getting the word out. The fifth colorway and the sixth colorway. And they're very different ways of getting all of that out to the totality. So when we're looking here at the structure of color, to see very clearly that unlike looking at lines in which you see the basic two trigrams, what you're looking at in color is very specific binaries, a triplicity of binaries, and by understanding that binary structure underneath it, the color, you can see why there is such a difference between the right angle process, personal destiny, and its geometry, and the left angle process, its transpersonal geometry, its transpersonal way of operating in the world. And after the break, I'll show you how that works.